Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a concept that, well, it underpins so much of our lives. Everything from the big picture, how societies are organized, right down to our everyday interactions.
Mhm.
It's the idea of justice. And it feels fundamental, doesn't it? We demand it, we feel its absence really acutely, but pinning down precisely what it is or how it works, even where it applies, that's surprisingly complex.
It really is. And what's fascinating and what our source material really digs into is how crucially our understanding of justice has shifted over time. Dramatically, in fact.
Yeah, absolutely. When you look back, justice is this, persistent theme in human thought, but its meaning, its application, they're not static at all.
Not at all. They've transformed, especially as societies themselves have evolved
Yeah,
and new political and social ideas have taken root.
exactly. So for this deep dive, we're using a key text on political theory as our guide, just this one source, really letting it lead the way. And our mission here is to really unpack the concept of justice through the lens of this specific material. We want to explore what justice is fundamentally trying to achieve, according to this text.
hmm And where this whole idea is even a relevant consideration in the first place.
Yeah, and how its understanding has moved, from maybe older, more traditional views towards modern concepts like social justice.
And of course, looking at the different ways thinkers, as presented in this text, have grappled with this foundational idea.
Mhm.
What are the core problems it's trying to solve? What principles guide its pursuit?
That's the plan, distilling the essential insights from this analysis.
Should be interesting. It's a core concept.
Okay, let's get into it then. So the text we're exploring, it starts by grounding us in a very specific sort of modern understanding of what justice is primarily concerned with today.
Hmm.
It's presented not just as some, lofty, abstract ideal, but something deeply practical, tied to how society actually functions.
Yes, the material frames justice, particularly in the contemporary world, as being fundamentally preoccupied with figuring out logical criteria for allocation.
Allocation, meaning how stuff gets distributed.
Pretty much. How we
So,
distribute social advantages.
yeah.
That means deciding on fair rules for handing out resources, benefits, power, honors, all those positive things within a society.
But it's not just the good stuff, is it? I remember the text making a point that it's also about allocating the burdens, the obligations.
Precisely. That's a key part of the picture here. It's about how both the positive aspects and the less desirable aspects, the obligations and burdens of social life, are distributed.
Okay, so benefits and burdens.
And this focus on allocation, the text really emphasizes this, becomes particularly acute, particularly relevant in situations of scarcity.
Scarcity.
Right.
Meaning there just isn't enough of something desirable for everyone to have all they want or need.
Exactly that. When the demand for these social advantages, wealth, opportunities, power, whatever it is, outstrips the available supply, then the question of how we decide who gets what and maybe who has to contribute what becomes a central pressing problem.
And that's where this modern concept of justice, understood as fair allocation, really comes into its own.
That's where it takes center stage, according to this analysis.
Now, this material also flags right near the beginning that this modern view, this focus on social justice, it represents a pretty significant transformation.
Hmm.
It links it to the rise of democracy, socialism, a departure from older, maybe more traditional ideas.
Yes, and that historical context is flagged as crucial. It shows the concept isn't static. It adapts, it changes in response to these big shifts in social structures and political philosophies.
Yeah.
We'll definitely circle back to that historical shift later on.
Good. Because it feels important. It tells us our current understanding isn't the only way justice has ever been conceived.
Absolutely not.
So, okay. If modern justice, according to this text, is largely about fair allocation, especially under scarcity, it raises a really fascinating question that this material addresses directly. Where is the search for justice even relevant?
Right, because maybe surprisingly, this analysis argues it's not a relevant problem, or at least the search for new criteria isn't, in certain kinds of systems.
Which seems counterintuitive at first glance. You'd think justice is always relevant.
Well, the text makes a distinction. Justice as a moral idea might always be relevant in some sense, but the search for and the adoption of new criteria for justice, the kind of open debate and reform we often associate with it, that's not applicable everywhere.
Okay, so where doesn't this search apply, according to the text?
It identifies three main types of systems where the search for new criteria is essentially futile or irrelevant. First, a purely authoritarian system.
Okay, that one makes a certain kind of sense. If you have a dictator or an absolute monarch.
Exactly. In a purely authoritarian setup, The allocation of everything goods, power, obligations, you name it, is determined solely by the dictates of whoever holds the authority. There's no search for new principles of justice because the authority's word is the principle. The existing rules laid down from above are the only rules.
No room for questioning, no mechanism for proposing a more just way based on different criteria. The door is shut.
Pretty much. The second system mentioned is a purely competitive system.
Purely competitive, like a completely unregulated free market.
That's the idea. A system where allocation happens only through the unfettered play of market forces, supply, demand, competition. These dynamics alone dictate outcomes. In such a theoretical system, the text argues, there's no real scope for applying any new, consciously chosen criteria for allocation based on a search for justice.
Because the market mechanism itself is the sole allocator, its outcomes are just what they are.
From this perspective, yes. The allocation is simply the result of the market dynamic, not the result of a deliberate search for alternative principles of distribution. The process is the distribution mechanism.
Interesting. And the third one, a hypothetical, purely communist system. This one feels like the most surprising, maybe. Because communism is often talked about in relation to achieving some kind of justice or equality.
Right, but the text is very specific here. It's talking about a hypothetical, pure communist system, one that operates strictly under the rule allocation according to need.
Okay, from each according to ability to each according to need.
That's the principle. And the reasoning presented is this. If, hypothetically, a society could actually generate enough resources to genuinely meet everybody's needs, all needs fully satisfied, then the problem of injustice, specifically injustice as a problem of allocating scarce advantages, would theoretically vanish.
Because the scarcity is gone. If everyone has what they need, the whole issue of who gets what share of a limited pie disappears.
Precisely. In that hypothetical scenario, considering alternative principles for distributing scarce advantages becomes, well, pointless. The problem justice was trying to solve, allocation under scarcity, wouldn't exist anymore.
So the search for justice, in this specific allocation sense, only really kicks in when universal need satisfaction isn't possible, when there is scarcity.
That's the core idea presented, which leads us directly to where the text argues the search for justice is relevant and necessary.
Okay, where's that?
Two conditions need to be met. It's relevant only in an open society and, crucially, in a situation of scarcity.
We've covered scarcity demand outstripping supply. What about the open society? How does the text define that?
It defines an open society, in this context, as one where there is freedom to criticize the existing order in the light of a new logic, and to reform or reformulate the existing institutions by attaining public support for the proposed changes.
Right. That definition immediately clicks. Freedom to criticize, freedom to propose reforms, needing public support. That sounds like the breeding ground for debating justice.
Exactly. An open society provides the essential space. It's where criteria for allocation can be openly discussed, debated, potentially adopted, and then implemented through political processes.
And crucially, those criteria need to be, or at least be argued to be, broadly acceptable.
Yes, acceptable to all the individuals or categories of people concerned. That need for broad acceptability is key.
So debate, reform, acceptability hallmarks of where the search for justice is alive and active.
Definitely. But even within such an open society, the text adds a really important caveat.
Which is?
That there could be no final word on what the criteria of justice should be, no ultimate fixed answer.
Okay. So the search never really ends.
According to this analysis, no. It emphasizes that open societies must have functional channels for appeal, for protest, for ongoing public discourse. This allows the criteria themselves to be revisited, challenged, and revised by reason when new arguments or changing circumstances warrant it.
That really underscores the dynamic nature we touched on earlier. Justice isn't a destination you arrive at, but a continuous process of refinement.
A dynamic, ongoing quest. That's the picture painted here.
Okay, that sets a very clear stage. Justice as an active search for fair allocation rules is most relevant in open societies grappling with scarcity, and it's an ongoing, never-finished process. Now, the text takes a deeper philosophical dive, introducing a distinction between right and wrong versus good and evil. This is presented as absolutely fundamental.
It really is. This distinction helps clarify the specific kind of value judgment involved in justice. The material positions justice primarily as a problem of discovering the right course of action.
The right thing to do, the right way to structure things.
Exactly. And to grasp what right means here, the text insists we need to distinguish it clearly from good.
Which is easy to conflate, isn't it? We often think good things are right, bad things are wrong.
We do, but this analysis argues they operate differently. Good is described as being akin to concepts like useful, profitable, beneficial, while bad or evil aligns with harmful, damaging, disadvantageous.
Okay, so good is about benefit or utility. And the crucial point made is that good and bad aren't absolute.
That's right. They're not presented as either categories. Something isn't just purely good or purely bad.
Oh.
It can have elements of both. It can be partly good, partly bad.
The text uses the term continuum.
Exactly. Good and bad form a continuum, like a spectrum or a scale. Think of health, the example given. You can be very unhealthy, a bit unwell, okay, quite healthy, extremely healthy. It's a whole range of possibilities between the two extremes. You can slide along that scale.
That makes sense, a continuous range. So right and wrong are fundamentally different from this spectrum.
Completely different, according to this text. Right and wrong are presented as absolute categories. They stand in stark opposition to each other. Something is either right or wrong. There's no middle ground, no partly right.
Like the analogy used, true and false.
Yes, that's the parallel drawn. A statement in logic is either true or false. If it's got even a bit of falsehood in it, the whole thing is considered false. Similarly, a legal verdict might be guilty or not guilty, a strict binary. This kind of absolute either opposition is called a dichotomy.
A dichotomy, not a continuum. And there's that peculiar aspect mentioned. The negative seems to dominate.
This is a really striking point highlighted in the text. It observes that if a statement is only partly true, we generally classify it as false. If it's partly false, it's definitely false. And, crucially for justice, if an action or a situation is only partly right, the conclusion drawn is that it is wrong.
Wow. So almost right isn't good enough. It falls into the category of wrong. That sets an incredibly high absolute standard.
It does, and justice, in this framework, corresponds directly to right, while injustice corresponds to wrong. Justice belongs to that absolute qualitative category.
So it's not about degrees of goodness, but about meeting an absolute standard of rightness.
That's the core philosophical distinction being made. And this difference between the quantitative nature of good-bad, how much good, how much bad, and the qualitative nature of right-wrong, is it right, yes or no, has significant implications, particularly when considering theories like utilitarianism.
Right, because utilitarianism, especially Bentham's version, was all about measuring and maximizing quantities of pleasure or happiness, the good.
Exactly. Bentham's philosophic calculus was precisely about adding up units of pleasure and pain. And because good and bad are on that measurable continuum, you can theoretically calculate the greatest net good for the greatest number.
And the text argues this focus on the aggregate quantity of good often led mainstream utilitarianism to be, well, indifferent to questions of individual rightness or justice.
That's the critique presented. The focus was on the total sum of happiness, sometimes at the expense of how that happiness was distributed, or whether the treatment of certain individuals was right in this absolute sense. The material brings in John Rawls here as a key figure who strongly challenged this.
Rawls pointed out that you could have a situation that maximizes overall utility but is still deeply unjust to some.
Precisely. For Rawls and others who prioritize justice, that qualitative rightness of how individuals are treated takes precedence over simply maximizing the total quantity of good. The dignity and rights of the individual matter in an absolute way.
The text also touches on J.S. Mill's position, seeing him as a bit different from Bentham.
Yes, it presents Mill as a more nuanced utilitarian. While still concerned with happiness, Mill emphasized qualitative differences between pleasures, higher versus lower pleasures, and importantly placed a very high value on individual liberty, sometimes even prioritizing it over the opinion of the majority.
And this source interprets Mill's stance as moving away from pure quantitative utilitarianism.
Towards something closer to the idea of justice, yes. By focusing on the moral worth of actions and policies and fiercely defending individual dignity and liberty, Mill is seen as restoring a concern for the individual right that was somewhat lost in the purely quantitative approach. This tendency, the text suggests, finds its full expression later in Rawls' theory, which puts justice first.
That distinction is powerful. Justice isn't just about making things generally better. It's about meeting a standard of fundamental rightness in how we treat each other and structure society.
It gives justice its unique moral force.
Okay, moving on. We hinted at this earlier, but the text makes it a central argument. Justice, even though it's presented as this absolute ideal of right, is fundamentally dynamic. It changes.
This is absolutely key to the understanding presented. Justice is described as an ideal, yes, maybe like absolute truth, but our grasp of that ideal, our understanding of that truth, isn't fixed. It's presented as a continuous process of realization and comprehension.
And this evolution is tied to something called social consciousness.
Yes, the development of our collective understanding, our shared awareness of human dignity, fairness, and social possibilities. As social consciousness evolves, so does our perception of what constitutes justice.
So, what society collectively deems just or unjust isn't set in stone. It shifts as our moral and social understanding deepens.
Exactly. And the material uses some really stark historical examples to hammer this point home. Practices and institutions that were once widely accepted, even defended as just within their own context, are now almost universally condemned as profound injustices.
Like slavery and serfdom in Europe's past.
Absolutely central to those societies for centuries, rationalized and justified, yet now seen as fundamentally unjust.
Or the caste system and untouchability in India, accepted for so long.
Deeply embedded, yet now recognized as a violation of justice and human dignity.
The inferior status of women globally, not that long ago.
Taken as natural as the proper order, now understood as a fundamental injustice.
And racial discrimination, legally sanctioned in some places quite recently.
Defended with elaborate justifications, now viewed as unequivocally unjust by dominant global norms. These shifts are dramatic proof of the concept's dynamism, and the text argues that these very changes, the evolving outlooks, the growing consensus favoring human liberty and equality, demonstrate the dynamic character of the idea of justice itself. Our standards change because our understanding changes.
It reinforces that point about justice being based on reason, but that reason itself isn't static. It develops alongside social consciousness. The text quotes D.D. Raphael saying the meaning of justice has to be determined in the light of modern consciousness.
Right. We're not bound by the potentially limited understanding of past eras. Our current, hopefully more developed collective reason and moral sense should guide our understanding of justice today.
But with the crucial caveat, again, that our current understanding isn't the final word either.
Exactly. The text explicitly warns against assuming we've reached the perfect ultimate definition. We need to remain open to new, progressive ideas about justice that are backed by reason, because social consciousness itself is always evolving, always growing.
It frames justice not as a fixed code, but as an ongoing conversation informed by our evolving moral landscape.
A living concept, constantly being reevaluated.
Okay, building on that dynamism, the text then explores how justice connects with and even synthesizes three other major principles: liberty, equality, and fraternity. It brings in Ernest Barker's perspective here.
Yes, Barker's view, as presented in the source, is quite compelling. He sees justice not as just another principle alongside liberty, equality, and fraternity, but as the underlying synthesis that holds them together.
The master principle, almost.
In a way, justice is seen as the thread that runs through them, the basic idea that connects them, and the final goal that helps reconcile their potential conflicts. It shapes them into universal principles for how society should be governed. According to Barker, we value liberty, equality, and fraternity precisely because they are manifestations of justice.
So they aren't independent values competing with justice, but rather different facets of justice.
That's the core of Barker's synthesis, as explained here. Let's break down how the text traces these connections, starting with liberty. Why do we insist that human relationships should be based on reason and principles, not just arbitrary power or chance or blind tradition?
The text links it back to human dignity. Our sense of justice recognizes that inherent worth in people.
Yes, and that dignity comes from our shared capacity for reason, our rational nature. This inherent dignity demands that every single individual be treated as an end in itself, not just as a tool or a means to someone else's end.
A fundamental respect for personhood.
And recognizing that inherent worth in everyone immediately leads to the idea that individuals must be treated as equal in this fundamental respect. It doesn't matter where you were born, your race, religion, gender, wealth. Everyone shares this rational nature and dignity.
And therefore, everyone has potential and deserves an equal measure of freedom to develop that potential. The text points to the French Declaration. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights.
That declaration perfectly captures that initial link. Liberty and equality both flowing from the recognition of human dignity, which is itself grounded in justice. But then the analysis gets more complex. It argues that liberty on its own isn't enough. To truly align with justice, liberty needs to be qualified by equality.
Qualified. How does equality qualify liberty? Doesn't liberty just mean being free from constraints?
Well, the text argues that absolute liberty, understood simply as the total absence of restraint, becomes a self-contradiction if you try to make it a universal principle applying equally to everyone.
Why a contradiction?
Because if my liberty is absolutely unrestrained, I am inevitably free to act in ways that restrain or even destroy your liberty. Think about it. Unrestrained freedom for the strong or the ruthless quickly becomes oppression for the weak or the vulnerable.
My freedom to pollute infringes on your freedom to breathe clean air, for example.
Exactly. Unrestrained liberty for one, or for a few, can effectively mean slavery or severe limitation for everyone else. So to resolve this contradiction and make liberty a workable principle for all, you need equality.
Equality acts as the necessary boundary condition.
Precisely. The restraints placed on liberty must be those needed to ensure that one person's freedom doesn't negate another person's equal and similar freedom. Barker's quote, cited in the text, puts it beautifully. The need of liberty for each is necessarily qualified and conditioned by the need of liberty for all. Liberty has to be relative to others, adjusted, and therefore regulated. True liberty, shared liberty, requires rules based on equality.
So the only justifiable limits on liberty are those imposed in the name of ensuring equal liberty for others, driven by justice.
That's the argument presented. Liberty must be qualified by equality.
Okay, that makes sense. But the synthesis goes further. The text then argues that equality, even this concept of equal liberty, also needs qualification. It needs fraternity.
Right. Defining equality simply as the absence of discrimination, just treating everyone formally the same under the law, isn't seen as the final word for justice either.
Why not? Isn't treating everyone the same the definition of equality?
It might work reasonably well in purely formal contexts like equality before the law or equal voting rights, but the text argues this breaks down, especially in the economic sphere, when you apply it to a society already marked by deep inequalities in wealth, power, and status.
Because treating fundamentally unequal people equally can just reinforce the existing inequality.
Exactly. If you have a powerful employer and a vulnerable worker or a big corporation and a small consumer, simply applying the same rules without discrimination might actually lead to unjust outcomes because the initial playing field is so uneven. The stronger party can easily exploit the weaker one within those equal rules.
So justice requires something more than just formal non-discrimination in those situations.
Yes, the text argues that justice actually requires special protection or positive consideration for those who are already deprived or underprivileged. This is needed to shield them from the potential excesses of the more dominant sections of society.
Like laws giving tenants certain rights against landlords, or workers' rights against employers.
Those are good examples. The text calls this reasonable discrimination in favor of the weaker party.
That phrase, reasonable discrimination, still sounds jarring next to equality.
It does initially, but the text connects this idea directly to the principle of fraternity, the idea of brotherhood, mutual support, social solidarity, and importantly, this support isn't seen as charity.
It's presented as a right.
Yes, a right stemming from our shared membership in society. Fraternity, applied as a right, resolves the potential harshness of pure, unqualified equality. In a world of significant economic disparities, pure formal equality could leave the vulnerable exposed to cruel market forces, potentially leading to their marginalization. Fraternity demands we step in, provide support, and ensure a basic level of dignity and protection for all as a matter of justice.
So just like liberty needs equality, equality needs fraternity to prevent unjust outcomes in unequal conditions.
That's the synthesis. And again, any limitation on strict equality, any reasonable discrimination, is only justifiable if it's demonstrably in favor of the weaker section and serves the broader goals of justice and fraternity.
Okay, so the full picture of justice, according to this synthesis, involves human relations regulated by liberty, but a liberty qualified by equality, and that equality further qualified by fraternity. It's quite a layered concept.
It is, and the ultimate aim of this synthesized justice.
The text says it's to ensure every individual gets a fair share of the advantages of social life, securing a common civic minimum for everyone.
Right. A baseline standard of living, opportunity, and dignity for all. Beyond that minimum, rewards can then be differentiated based on contribution or desert.
So it's not necessarily about identical outcomes for everyone, but guaranteeing that essential foundation first.
That seems to be the balance sought. And a key function of this synthesized justice is to actively prevent undue concentrations of wealth and power, stopping privileged groups from using their advantages to corner resources unfairly. Ultimately, it demands transforming the real-world social and economic conditions that block ordinary people from truly enjoying freedom and equality. It's about substantive reality, not just formal rights on paper.
Which leads us perfectly into discussing the different dimensions of modern justice. The text outlines. We've already touched on that shift from the traditional just man ideal to the modern focus on the just society or social justice.
Yes, the older view, whether Plato or traditional caste systems, often emphasized individuals fitting into a pre-existing hierarchical order. Justice was about maintaining that order through individual virtue and fulfilling one's defined role.
Whereas the modern concept is actively trying to change the social order, it's progressive.
Exactly. The goal shifts from individuals conforming to the existing structure to transforming the structure itself to better serve human values and flourishing. That's the core idea of social justice. The text quotes Raphael again, saying social justice often comes from reformers and makes those benefiting from the status quo nervous.
Because it inherently challenges the existing distribution of power and resources. It's the voice of the underprivileged demanding a fairer deal.
Precisely. It addresses the problem of a defective distribution of society's values and seeks a more appropriate allocation.
And the text applies this modern justice across several dimensions: legal, political, socioeconomic, seeing them as interconnected parts of the overall picture of social justice.
Let's start with legal justice. The text draws a distinction here between two aspects. A, justice according to law, and B, law according to justice.
Okay, justice according to laws sounds straightforward. Just apply the existing laws fairly and impartially.
That's the view the text associates with Alf Ross. He emphasized efficient, impartial administration of whatever law exists. Ross was skeptical about judging laws based on external moral values, seeing them as unverifiable. For him, a good law was an efficient one, achieving its purpose. Justice was simply conformity to the existing law.
The focus is purely on the procedural aspect of applying the law.
Primarily, yes. The text mentions Ross arguing that even in totalitarian states, injustice often arose not from inherently bad laws, but from judges not applying the fixed rules consistently. That highlights his procedural focus.
Okay. What about the second aspect? Law according to justice. This sounds like the law itself needs to be just.
This is the view linked to Ernest Barker. He distinguished between positive law, the actual laws of a community, and natural law, a supposed universal standard of rightness, inherently just. Barker argued law gets its validity, its binding force, backed by the state from political authority, but it gets its value, its moral authority, its claim on our conscience from its alignment with justice.
So the best laws have both state backing and moral legitimacy.
That's Barker's ideal, as presented here. The most effective law is one that conforms to justice and has state authority. The text ultimately sides with Barker's view, arguing it's sounder. Legal justice requires both efficient administration and laws that embody human values reflecting the current social consciousness. If laws lag behind evolving values, they become obstacles, dead weight, and risk social unrest or even revolution.
That's a strong case for law reform being essential for justice.
It connects legal justice back to that dynamic element. Next up, political justice. The text notes broader uses of the term, but focuses specifically on transforming political institutions, processes, and rights to align with justice.
What does that involve practically?
Several key elements. First, establishing democratic institutions that genuinely represent the people's interests, not just those of a privileged few. This means things like universal adult suffrage, an independent judiciary, the rule of law ensuring government acts predictably through established procedures, not arbitrarily, and constitutional limits on power.
Basic democratic building blocks.
Exactly. Second, guaranteeing fundamental liberties of thought and expression, especially the right to criticize the government. Without that, accountability is impossible.
Essential for an open society.
And third, complete freedom of association, allowing people to form parties, interest groups, unions enabling citizens to articulate their interests, express approval or disapproval, and organize peacefully to influence government democratically.
So political justice is about ensuring everyone has access to fair and effective ways to participate in political life and resolve conflicts.
In essence, yes, making the mechanisms for resolving conflicting interests universally available.
Okay. And finally, socioeconomic justice. The text combines these two terms deliberately.
Yes, highlighting that achieving social justice inevitably requires tackling economic structures and inequalities. The social and economic are intertwined.
How does it define economic justice narrowly?
In that restricted sense, it's about reordering specific economic relationships, employer-worker, trader-consumer, landlord-tenant, to prevent the exploitation of weaker parties.
And social justice is the broader term in encompassing this.
Yes, social justice is more comprehensive. It includes economic justice, but also aims to restore dignity lost due to broader social factors like lack of education or cultural marginalization. The phrase economic growth with social justice captures this, ensuring growth benefits everyone, especially the most disadvantaged.
So socioeconomic justice, broadly, is about reallocating both material resources and things like dignity and opportunity.
Yes, it's presented as a progressive ideal, a model for development. The Indian Constitution's preamble, promising social, economic, and political justice, is cited as an example of embedding this broad vision.
And the text stresses that the economic aspect is particularly critical.
Absolutely. The argument made is that severe economic disparities inevitably corrode the foundations of legal and political justice. Formal rights mean little if people lack the basic economic means to exercise them or live with dignity. Economic injustice breeds instability.
So true social justice requires fundamentally reordering society, so benefits aren't hoarded by the privileged but genuinely uplift the wider population, embodying that synthesis of liberty, equality, and fraternity we discussed.
Exactly. The text gives concrete examples. Free expression combined with elections truly free from money's influence. Formal equality not undermined by vast disparities preventing access to courts or opportunities. Special safeguards for minorities reflecting fraternity. Property rights balanced against the common good. Production aimed at social needs. These are the substantive goals.
That paints a really clear picture of how modern justice seeks to reshape society across these interconnected fronts, with the economic dimensions seen as foundational.
It connects the abstract principles to concrete social structures and outcomes.
Right. So we've journeyed from justice as allocation, through its philosophy, its dynamic nature, its synthesis with other values, and its various dimensions.
Which leads us logically to a major contemporary debate the text highlights. The tension between procedural justice versus substantive justice.
This feels like it gets to the heart of many real-world arguments about fairness. Is it about the rules of the game or the final score?
That's a great way to put it. Where does the emphasis lie?
Let's unpack procedural justice first. What's the core idea?
The fundamental principle here is this. If you can establish a just procedure, fair rules, applied impartially for allocating social advantages, then whatever distribution results from following that procedure is automatically considered just.
The fairness is baked into the process, so the outcome must be fair.
Exactly. Fair process equals just result, regardless of what that result looks like in terms of who gets what. The text strongly links this view to liberal traditions, focusing on fair rules for individual interaction.
Freedom of contract is often key here.
Yes, that and the state's role being primarily to enforce those fair rules, prevent force, prevent fraud, but otherwise let individuals compete and interact freely under those rules.
The text uses the analogy of a fair race, which is quite intuitive.
It captures it perfectly. Proponents would say justice in a race isn't about who deserves to win based on some moral judgment. It's just about whether the rules were fair, no cheating, same starting line, etc. If the process was fair, the winner is the just winner, period.
And this often gets applied to the market economy as the ideal procedure.
Yes, the argument often is that the free market, with its competitive rules, is the most efficient and fair procedure for allocating resources. Trying to interfere with the market's outcomes through social policy to achieve a specific distribution is seen as potentially inefficient or unjust because it violates the fair procedure.
The text mentions figures like Spencer, Hayek, Friedman, Nozick as proponents of this view, though it notes Rawls has a more nuanced procedural theory.
Right. Broadly, these thinkers advocate for limited government intervention, focusing on enforcing the rules of the game, not engineering specific outcomes. The text does acknowledge a progressive element here. Procedural justice rejects discrimination based on arbitrary factors like race or gender, insisting on applying the same rules to everyone, thus affirming equal moral worth in that sense.
But it also highlights some pretty sharp critiques of taking this purely procedural idea too far.
Very sharp critiques. It points to the potential harshness. Herbert Spencer, for example, is cited for applying survival of the fittest directly to human society, arguing against helping the disadvantaged because it supposedly hinders progress by taking resources from the strong.
which, as the text notes, seems to ignore the fundamental difference between the natural world and human society governed by moral principles.
A crucial distinction. Hayek is mentioned as seeing the market as promoting competition, not distributive justice. Friedman argued against welfare measures, seeing competitive capitalism as vital for freedom. Nozick argued the state shouldn't redistribute justly acquired property.
And C.B. Macpherson's critique sounds particularly deep.
It is. Macpherson, as presented, argues that the capitalist market system, often lauded for its procedures, can actually limit true human freedom and flourishing. People might be forced to use their talents just to meet market demands, not pursue their own goals. He asks, essentially, if a system constrains people's development in this way, how can we call the outcomes just, even if the procedures seem fair on the surface?
That's a powerful challenge. Can a procedure be truly just if its predictable outcomes include widespread constraint or massive inequality?
It cuts to the core of the debate, and it leads us directly to the alternative perspective. Substantive justice, also called social justice or distributive justice.
Okay, so this slide focuses squarely on the results, the actual distribution.
Precisely. The core idea here is that the allocation or distribution itself must be just. The procedure used to get there is secondary. Procedure should be designed or adjusted in order to achieve a just outcome. The just result is the primary goal.
And this view is linked more closely to socialist thought.
Generally, yes. The key test of justice, from this perspective, is whether the society's arrangements provide the poor and underprivileged with adequate opportunities to improve their lives and live with dignity. The demand is for proactive policies to correct unjust distributions and expand opportunities for those left behind.
So it's a fundamental difference in focus. Fair rules versus fair outcomes.
That really captures the central tension presented between these two approaches to justice.
All right, we've covered an immense amount of ground here, defining justice, its sphere of relevance, its philosophical core, its dynamism, its synthesis with liberty, equality, fraternity, its different dimensions, and now this core debate between procedure and substance.
We've really unpacked the key arguments and distinctions laid out in this source material.
Which brings us to the conclusion section of the text's analysis. It reflects on how societies, especially open ones facing scarcity, can navigate the practical challenges of allocation given all these complexities. It restates that justice is this core moral guide for policy in these specific contexts.
And it revisits those two main criteria for allocation we discussed earlier, A, according to need, and B, according to desert or merit.
And the text makes it clear that relying purely on either one is problematic.
Yes. Pure need-based allocation, it argues, is impossible under scarcity. If you distribute everything just based on need, regardless of contribution, the incentive to work and produce collapses, leading to less for everyone. General impoverishment.
Makes sense. What about pure desert-based allocation, like a totally competitive system ignoring needs?
That's also deemed unacceptable by the text. It warns this could lead to large numbers of people living in degrading subhuman conditions simply because they lack marketable skills or face misfortune, resulting in moral decay and wasted human potential.
So neither extreme works if you're aiming for a just society in the real world of scarcity.
Therefore, the text concludes, justice requires a blend of both criteria, a combination.
How does it suggest prioritizing within that blend?
The first priority, according to this analysis, must be providing for the minimum needs of all human beings. This comes before rewarding desert. Everyone gets a basic foundation, irrespective of their contribution.
And what's included in minimum needs, according to this material?
It lists the basics like subsistence, food, shelter, healthcare, some education, but also, significantly, job opportunities. Having work is seen as crucial not just for income, but for self-respect.
And when allocating based on need, the focus should be on the most needy individual.
Yes, prioritize the neediest first. And the text adds that important caution about group-based concessions, potentially creating vested interests or overlooking needy individuals outside those groups. The ideal focus is individual need.
Right, target the help accurately. Okay, so first, meet minimum needs for all. What comes next?
After those minimum needs are secured for everyone, the text suggests, then additional rewards can be distributed based on the principle of desert.
But even desert isn't straightforward, as the text points out. It's not just about raw effort or talent in a vacuum.
No, it acknowledges the complexities. Reward based on desert usually depends on a mix of factors. Innate talents and skills, yes, but also effort, the opportunities available, and crucially, social demand for what you offer.
Talent and effort feel fair enough as grounds for reward.
They're less controversial. But Opportunity and social demand are the tricky parts, often largely outside an individual's control. You can be talented and work hard, but if there's no opportunity or no one values what you do.
Your desert goes unrewarded. The text mentioned the Spartan poet versus the warrior example.
Exactly. Or McPherson's point about capitalism rewarding market-friendly talents. Social demand fluctuates, opportunities vary wildly. These external factors heavily influence who gets rewarded based on desert.
So even the desert principle is complicated by factors that don't necessarily reflect individual merit or effort in a pure sense.
That's the challenge highlighted. And because individuals face these constraints regarding opportunity and social demand, the text concludes by stressing the necessary role of the state in managing this blended approach.
The state needs to step in to make the desert part fairer, too.
Yes, given that individuals can't fully control opportunity or social demand, the text suggests the state has a role to play in ensuring justice. This includes actively working to create adequate opportunities for people to develop and use their talents. And also, interestingly, encouraging sublime arts and professions, things valuable to society that the market might not adequately reward on its own.
So the state should try to level the playing field of opportunity somewhat and also ensure that valuable contributions beyond pure market utility are supported.
That appears to be the implication drawn from the analysis of the difficulties in applying a pure desert principle justly.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive, drawing solely on our source material, has shown justice to be, well, incredibly multifaceted. From its practical role in allocation, its philosophical depth, its dynamic nature, its synthesis with other core values, to its application across society, and this fundamental tension between procedure and substance, need and desert. It's definitely not a simple concept.
No, it's presented as this ongoing, complex human endeavor, constantly wrestling with principles, practicalities, scarcity, inequality, and all those unpredictable factors that shape distribution in society.
And as the text kept reminding us, it's a concept demanding constant re-examination through reason, guided by our evolving social consciousness, not a finished product.
A living concept, absolutely central to how we think about a good society.
So for you, our listener, after exploring all these layers presented in the text, thinking about that difficult balance between meeting basic needs for everyone and rewarding individual contributions, while acknowledging how much things like opportunity and shifting social values impact who gets what, how should a society realistically try to juggle these factors?
How can we aim for a distribution of benefits and burdens that feels genuinely just, especially given that our very understanding of justice keeps evolving? What part of this complex puzzle, as laid out in this material, strikes you as the most challenging or perhaps the most crucial element to get right? It's a question this analysis really leaves us to ponder.